General Thomas Wilson never imagined his ordinary drive home would turn into one of the most challenging moments of his decorated military career. At 55 years old, he carried himself with the same straight-backed dignity that had become second nature after more than 3 decades in uniform. The evening sun cast long shadows across the road as he drove his navy blue sedan, the trunk still holding his neatly pressed dress uniform from the morning's strategy meeting at Fort Bragg. Wilson had climbed the ranks of the United States Army through hard work, determination, and an unwavering belief in the country he served. His journey hadn't been easy. Growing up in a small town where his family had faced their share of prejudice, he'd found purpose and belonging in military service. Each promotion came with new challenges, but Wilson met them all with the same quiet resolve that had become his trademark among fellow officers. The radio played softly in the background, a classic jazz station that reminded him of Sunday afternoons in his grandfather's living room. His grandfather, a Korean War veteran, had been the one to first plant the seed of military service in young Thomas's mind. "Serve with honor," he'd always said, "and nobody can take your dignity from you." Those words had guided Wilson through 3 combat deployments, countless diplomatic missions, and finally to the Pentagon, where he now served as one of the highest-ranking African-American officers in the military. His office walls held photographs of him with 2 different presidents, foreign dignitaries, and troops he commanded across the globe. But the picture he treasured most sat on his desk, a faded snapshot of him as a young lieutenant with his grandfather, both in uniform, pride shining in the older man's eyes. The weight of responsibility never left Wilson's shoulders, even on this rare Friday when he'd managed to leave work early enough to make it home for dinner with his wife. After 32 years of service, family time remained precious and all too rare. His wife had prepared his favorite meal to celebrate his brief time at home before he'd need to fly to Europe for a NATO meeting next week. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from his daughter, who was flying in from college tomorrow to spend the weekend at home. "Can't wait to see you, Dad," it read, with a string of heart emojis that made him smile. His children had grown up on military bases around the world, resilient and adaptable like most military kids, but that didn't make the time apart any easier. The Distinguished Service Medal in his home office display case, along with the Legion of Merit and other commendations, told the story of a career devoted to excellence. But Wilson's greatest pride came from mentoring younger officers, especially those who faced the same barriers he had overcome. Just last month, he'd spoken at West Point, looking out at faces far more diverse than when he'd sat in those same seats decades ago. As he turned onto the tree-lined street that would eventually lead him home, Wilson thought about tomorrow's plans. His wife wanted to show him the new garden she planted, and he looked forward to grilling steaks in the backyard, simple pleasures that seemed extraordinary after months of Pentagon briefings and international security concerns. The evening was peaceful, the road nearly empty as the work week wound down. Wilson adjusted his rearview mirror and loosened his tie slightly. After a lifetime in uniform, even civilian clothes felt strange sometimes, but he was looking forward to these 3 days of being just Thomas, husband, father, gardener, and grillmaster, rather than General Wilson. The sky had turned a deeper blue as day faded into evening. Wilson checked his watch. He'd be home in 20 minutes, with plenty of time to help set the table and hear about his wife's day teaching at the local community college. These small moments of normalcy were what he fought to protect all these years. Little did he know that the flashing lights about to appear in his rearview mirror would change everything. The blue and red lights flashed in General Wilson's rearview mirror, cutting through the peaceful evening like an unwelcome alarm. His first thought wasn't fear but simple confusion. He'd been driving exactly at the speed limit, his car was in perfect condition, and he hadn't made any traffic violations. Years of military discipline kicked in as he carefully signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the quiet suburban road. Wilson took a deep breath and followed the routine he'd discussed with his son when the boy first got his driver's license. Hands on the steering wheel, visible at 10 and 2. Turn on the interior light so the approaching officer could see inside clearly. Keep all movements slow and deliberate. These weren't just instructions he'd given to his children, they were survival tactics that many black parents taught their kids, regardless of rank or status. The headlights of the police cruiser shone bright in his mirrors, making it hard to see the officer who was now approaching. Wilson rolled down his window and waited, his military ID and driver's license already on the dashboard where he placed them with careful, measured movements. 30 years of commanding troops in high-pressure situations had taught him to stay calm in any crisis, and this was no different. "Good evening, officer," Wilson said politely as a flashlight beam swept across his face and through the car interior. The bright light lingered on his hands, then moved to his face again, momentarily blinding him. "License and registration," came the curt reply. No greeting returned. The voice belonged to a young man, probably in his 30s, Wilson guessed. The officer's face remained partially shadowed behind the flashlight beam, but Wilson could make out a tight expression and eyes that seemed to be looking for trouble rather than ensuring public safety. "My license is on the dashboard, officer. I'm going to reach for my registration from the glove compartment now, if that's all right," Wilson said clearly, not moving until he received permission. He'd been taught never to make sudden moves during a traffic stop. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" the officer asked, ignoring Wilson's question. His tone carried an edge of suspicion that was all too familiar to Wilson, who had experienced it many times during his younger years before the uniform and rank provided some measure of protection. "I'm heading home from Fort Bragg. I live about 20 minutes from here," Wilson answered calmly, keeping his voice steady and respectful despite the unnecessary question. He'd driven this route hundreds of times before without incident. The officer's flashlight beam swept across the backseat and then returned to Wilson's face. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he ordered, his hand now resting casually on his holster in a gesture that was anything but casual. Wilson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Something wasn't right about this stop. "May I ask why?" "Have I violated a traffic law, officer?" he asked, still maintaining his composure, though his instincts were now on high alert. "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, louder this time, taking a half step back from the car door in a standard position that gave him tactical advantage. Wilson nodded slowly. "I understand, officer." "I'm opening my door now and stepping out slowly," he narrated his actions, just as he would advise anyone to do in this situation. As he carefully exited the car, he noticed the officer's name tag, Officer P. Reynolds. Standing tall in his civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, Wilson's military bearing was still evident. Most people could spot him as military from a mile away, even without the uniform. But Officer Reynolds seemed unimpressed, or perhaps deliberately blind to the indicators of Wilson's service and status. "Place your hands on the hood," Reynolds instructed, his voice carrying an authority that seemed excessive for a routine traffic stop with no clear violation. As Wilson complied, he caught sight of a neighbor walking his dog on the opposite side of the street, slowing down to watch the scene unfold with obvious concern. The evening had turned from peaceful to tense in a matter of minutes, and Wilson knew that what happened next would depend as much on the officer's intentions as on his own carefully measured responses. What neither of them knew was that this routine traffic stop was about to become national news. With his hands on the hood of his car, General Wilson could feel the situation slipping away from him. The cool metal beneath his palms contrasted with the warm evening air. Officer Reynolds circled him slowly, flashlight beam moving up and down, as if searching for something, anything, to justify his suspicion. "Officer, may I ask again why I was pulled over?" Wilson spoke clearly but kept his tone respectful. 30 years of military service had taught him how to address those in authority, even when he outranked them in the larger world. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Reynolds replied vaguely, not bothering to elaborate on what description or what kind of suspect. "ID," he demanded, though Wilson's license still sat visibly on the dashboard where he placed it before the officer approached. "My driver's license is on the dashboard, Officer Reynolds. My military ID is in my wallet. Would you like me to get that for you as well?" Wilson asked, not moving until given permission. Reynolds' expression hardened. "Military ID? What are you claiming to be, Army or something?" The skepticism in his voice was unmistakable. "Yes, sir, United States Army. I'm stationed at the Pentagon, currently visiting Fort Bragg 4. "Right." Reynolds cut him off with a dismissive snort. "Let's see this military ID." Wilson slowly reached toward his back pocket. "I'm reaching for my wallet now, officer." As Wilson carefully extracted his military identification, he noticed a second patrol car pulling up behind Reynolds's cruiser, its lights adding to the red and blue glow now illuminating the entire street. Neighbors had begun to gather on porches and sidewalks, watching the scene unfold with concerned expressions. Wilson handed over his military ID, which clearly displayed his rank of general along with security clearance information that would be obvious to anyone with even basic knowledge of military credentials. Reynolds barely glanced at it. "This doesn't look right," he said, though the ID was standard issue with holographic security features impossible to fake. Anyone can get fake IDs these days. The second officer approached, a younger man with a puzzled expression as he took in the scene. "Everything okay here, Reynolds?" "Got someone claiming to be an Army general," Reynolds said with a smirk that made Wilson's stomach tighten. "Driving through the area, acting suspicious." Wilson remained silent, years of navigating difficult situations telling him this was not the moment to object. The second officer, however, gave him a quick once-over and seemed to notice what Reynolds had missed, the bearing and composure that came from decades of military command. "Sir, can you tell me where you're coming from?" the second officer asked, his tone noticeably more professional. "Fort Bragg. I had meetings there today and was heading home," Wilson replied calmly. "My credentials are genuine, officer. You're welcome to verify them." Reynolds stepped between them. "I'll handle this, Clark. Go run the plates." He turned back to Wilson, eyes narrowed. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Officer, is that really necessary?" "I've cooperated fully and—" "Hands behind your back now." Reynolds's voice rose sharply as his hand moved to his handcuffs. Wilson complied, the indignity of the moment not lost on him. After commanding thousands of troops and advising presidents, he was being treated like a common criminal for driving while black. As the cold metal closed around his wrists, he noticed a woman across the street had taken out her phone and appeared to be recording the scene. "Officer Reynolds," Wilson said quietly as he was being cuffed, "I'd like to note your badge number and request to speak to your supervising officer." This simple, professional request seemed to trigger something in Reynolds. His grip tightened unnecessarily on Wilson's arm as he began to lead him toward the patrol car. "You'll have plenty of time to file complaints down at the station," he said, loud enough for the gathering onlookers to hear. As he was guided into the back seat of the police cruiser, Wilson caught sight of his military ID and driver's license still sitting on the hood of his car, along with his keys and phone. The second officer, Clark, looked uncomfortable but said nothing as Reynolds slammed the door shut. Through the window, Wilson could see neighbors talking urgently among themselves, one making a phone call. Little did Officer Reynolds know that his routine traffic stop was quickly spiraling into something that would soon reach the highest levels of the U.S. government. With his hands on the hood of his car, General Wilson could feel the situation slipping away from him. The cool metal beneath his palms contrasted with the warm evening air. Officer Reynolds circled him slowly, flashlight beam moving up and down, as if searching for something, anything, to justify his suspicion. "Officer, may I ask again why I was pulled over?" Wilson spoke clearly but kept his tone respectful. 30 years of military service had taught him how to address those in authority, even when he outranked them in the larger world. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Reynolds replied vaguely, not bothering to elaborate on what description or what kind of suspect. "ID," he demanded, though Wilson's license still sat visibly on the dashboard where he placed it before the officer approached. "My driver's license is on the dashboard, Officer Reynolds. My military ID is in my wallet. Would you like me to get that for you as well?" Wilson asked, not moving until given permission. Reynolds' expression hardened. "Military ID? What are you claiming to be, Army or something?" The skepticism in his voice was unmistakable. "Yes, sir, United States Army. I'm stationed at the Pentagon, currently visiting Fort Bragg 4. "Right." Reynolds cut him off with a dismissive snort. "Let's see this military ID." Wilson slowly reached toward his back pocket. "I'm reaching for my wallet now, officer." As Wilson carefully extracted his military identification, he noticed a second patrol car pulling up behind Reynolds' cruiser, its lights adding to the red and blue glow now illuminating the entire street. Neighbors had begun to gather on porches and sidewalks, watching the scene unfold with concerned expressions. Wilson handed over his military ID, which clearly displayed his rank of general along with security clearance information that would be obvious to anyone with even basic knowledge of military credentials. Reynolds barely glanced at it. "This doesn't look right," he said, though the ID was standard issue with holographic security features impossible to fake. Anyone can get fake IDs these days. The second officer approached, a younger man with a puzzled expression as he took in the scene. "Everything okay here, Reynolds?" "Got someone claiming to be an Army general," Reynolds said with a smirk that made Wilson's stomach tighten. "Driving through the area, acting suspicious." Wilson remained silent, years of navigating difficult situations telling him this was not the moment to object. The second officer, however, gave him a quick once-over and seemed to notice what Reynolds had missed, the bearing and composure that came from decades of military command. "Sir, can you tell me where you're coming from?" the second officer asked, his tone noticeably more professional. "Fort Bragg. I had meetings there today and was heading home," Wilson replied calmly. "My credentials are genuine, officer. You're welcome to verify them." Reynolds stepped between them. "I'll handle this, Clark. Go run the plates." He turned back to Wilson, eyes narrowed. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Officer, is that really necessary?" "I've cooperated fully and—" "Hands behind your back now." Reynolds' voice rose sharply as his hand moved to his handcuffs. Wilson complied, the indignity of the moment not lost on him. After commanding thousands of troops and advising presidents, he was being treated like a common criminal for driving while black. As the cold metal closed around his wrists, he noticed a woman across the street had taken out her phone and appeared to be recording the scene. "Officer Reynolds," Wilson said quietly as he was being cuffed, "I'd like to note your badge number and request to speak to your supervising officer." This simple, professional request seemed to trigger something in Reynolds. His grip tightened unnecessarily on Wilson's arm as he began to lead him toward the patrol car. "You'll have plenty of time to file complaints down at the station," he said, loud enough for the gathering onlookers to hear. As he was guided into the back seat of the police cruiser, Wilson caught sight of his military ID and driver's license still sitting on the hood of his car, along with his keys and phone. The second officer, Clark, looked uncomfortable but said nothing as Reynolds slammed the door shut. Through the window, Wilson could see neighbors talking urgently among themselves, one making a phone call. Little did Officer Reynolds know that his routine traffic stop was quickly spiraling into something that would soon reach the highest levels of the U.S. government. The ride to the police station felt longer than it was. General Wilson sat upright in the back seat of the patrol car, the handcuffs digging uncomfortably into his wrists. Through the mesh divider, he could hear Officer Reynolds talking on the radio, describing him as uncooperative and resistant, words that couldn't be further from the truth. Wilson watched the familiar streets pass by, the same roads he'd traveled countless times before without incident. Now, instead of arriving home to his wife's cooking and a peaceful evening, he was headed to a police station like a criminal. The irony wasn't lost on him. After defending his country for over 3 decades, his country's systems were now treating him as a threat. The second officer, Clark, followed behind in a separate patrol car. Wilson had noticed the younger officer's hesitation, the flicker of doubt in his eyes when Reynolds had dismissed the military ID. Perhaps there would be at least one reasonable person at the station. As they pulled into the police station parking lot, Wilson took a deep breath. He'd faced enemy fire in 3 different combat zones, navigated high-stakes diplomatic missions, and briefed presidents on matters of national security. This situation, while deeply unjust, was just another challenge to overcome with the same discipline and composure that had carried him through his career. Reynolds opened the back door. "Out," he ordered, as if speaking to a dog rather than a high-ranking military officer. Wilson stepped out carefully, maintaining his dignity despite the handcuffs. The station was small, typical for a suburban area, with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead as they entered through a side door. A few officers at desks looked up, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference, as Reynolds led him through to the processing area. "Got one claiming to be a big shot general," Reynolds announced to the booking officer, a heavy-set man with tired eyes who barely looked up from his computer. I am General Thomas Wilson, United States Army, Wilson stated calmly. I'd like to make a phone call, as is my right. The booking officer glanced up, taking in Wilson's appearance with slightly more interest. Charges? Resisting arrest, suspected false impersonation of a military officer, and driving suspiciously in a residential area, Reynolds replied, though Wilson had done none of these things. Driving suspiciously isn't a charge, Reynolds, the booking officer muttered, but typed it in anyway. Empty your pockets, he told Wilson. My personal effects are still in my vehicle or on the hood where Officer Reynolds left them, Wilson explained, including my identification. This seemed to surprise the booking officer, who looked at Reynolds with a frown. You left his ID at the scene? Reynolds shrugged. Clark's bringing it in. For the next 45 minutes, Wilson was photographed, fingerprinted, and processed like any other suspect. No one bothered to verify his identity or check his military credentials. His requests to contact his chain of command were ignored or met with dismissive comments. The indignity of the situation was matched only by its absurdity. Finally, he was led to a holding cell where two other men sat, one appearing to be homeless, and the other a young man who couldn't be more than 20. Both looked up when Wilson entered, then away quickly, each lost in their own troubles. Wilson sat on the metal bench, back straight, hands folded in his lap. The concrete walls were covered in scratched initials and crude drawings. A far cry from the Pentagon offices where he'd started his day. Officer Clark appeared at the cell door about 20 minutes later, looking uncomfortable. General Wilson, he said quietly, as if not wanting to be overheard. Your personal effects. He handed a clear plastic bag through the bars containing Wilson's wallet, keys, and phone. Wilson accepted them with a nod. Thank you, Officer Clark. Clark hesitated, then added in a low voice, I looked up your credentials in the system. You're really a general. 32 years of service, Wilson confirmed simply. Something changed in Clark's expression, a mix of shock and dismay. I need to speak to my sergeant, he said, and quickly walked away. Wilson checked his phone, 3 missed calls from his wife, wondering where he was. Instead of calling her back immediately, he scrolled to a contact labeled simply Pentagon Command. It was time to make one call that would change everything about this situation. As his thumb hovered over the call button, Wilson thought about all the young men and women who found themselves in holding cells without the power of the Pentagon behind them. The thought strengthened his resolve to not only address his situation, but to ensure it led to meaningful change. General Wilson pressed the call button and held the phone to his ear, aware of the young man across the cell watching him curiously. The line connected almost immediately, despite the late hour. The Pentagon Command Center operated 24/7, standing ready for any military crisis around the globe. Tonight, the crisis was much closer to home. Pentagon Command, answered a crisp, professional voice. This is General Thomas Wilson, Security Clearance Code Alpha 7 Delta 902. Wilson spoke clearly, using the identification protocol established for emergencies. I'm invoking Situation Protocol 4. There was a brief pause on the other end. Protocol 4 was rarely used. It was designed for high-ranking military personnel who found themselves in civilian emergencies where their identity or position might be compromised. Voice print confirmed, General Wilson, the duty officer responded. Can you briefly describe your situation, sir? Wilson kept his voice low but clear. I've been wrongfully detained by local police while driving home from Fort Bragg. Currently being held at Riverside Police Station on falsified charges. Officer refused to acknowledge military identification. The young man in the cell was now openly staring, his expression shifting from boredom to surprise as he began to realize who he was sharing a cell with. Understood, sir. Initiating immediate response. Stand by. The calm professionalism in the duty officer's voice was reassuring. Wilson knew what would happen next. A carefully choreographed series of calls would go out, starting with the military police liaison and moving quickly up the chain of command. Wilson ended the call and nodded politely to the young man across the cell. Shouldn't be too long now, he said quietly. The young man shook his head in disbelief. You really a general, mister? Like for real? Wilson nodded. United States Army. 32 years of service. And they still locked you up? Man, The young man looked down at his own hands. If they don't care about someone like you, what chance do the rest of us have? Before Wilson could respond, sounds of unusual activity echoed from the front of the station. New voices, authoritative ones, were speaking to the desk sergeant. One of them mentioned Pentagon loud enough for it to carry to the holding cells. Less than 5 minutes after his call, the door to the booking area swung open. A tall woman in a dark suit walked in, accompanied by Officer Clark and a visibly nervous station sergeant. Her bearing screamed federal agent, though she wore no identifying badge. "General Wilson," she called out, scanning the holding cells until she spotted him. "I'm Agent Chen from the Defense Department's liaison office. There seems to have been a serious misunderstanding." The sergeant hurried to unlock the cell door, avoiding eye contact with Wilson. "Sir, we had no idea of your identity. Officer Reynolds didn't properly." "We'll address the details later," Agent Chen cut him off. "General Wilson has an urgent security meeting to attend. This delay has already created potential complications." This was a polite fiction. There was no security meeting, but it allowed everyone to save face while getting Wilson released immediately. It was a tactic he recognized from diplomatic missions: create a scenario where cooperation becomes the only reasonable option. As Wilson stepped out of the cell, he turned to the young man still sitting inside. "What's your name, son?" "Anthony," the young man replied, surprised to be addressed. Wilson nodded. "I won't forget you, Anthony, or this place." It was a simple promise, but one he intended to keep. The station had transformed in the minutes since his call. Where there had been indifference or hostility, now there was nervous energy and respect. Officer Reynolds was nowhere to be seen, but several other officers watched with stunned expressions as Wilson was escorted through the station. In the lobby, 3 more people in suits waited: military legal counsel and a public affairs officer, Wilson guessed. Word traveled fast when a Pentagon emergency protocol was activated. "Your vehicle is being brought around, sir," Agent Chen informed him. "The Secretary of Defense has been briefed on the situation and would like to speak with you as soon as possible." Wilson nodded, maintaining his composure despite the satisfaction he felt. The machinery of military response had shifted from global threats to address this local injustice with impressive speed. As they walked toward the station exit, the police captain emerged from his office, face pale with shock and concern. This was clearly not how he had expected his evening to unfold, with the Pentagon essentially laying siege to his small police station over the wrongful arrest of a high-ranking military officer. The night wasn't over yet. In fact, the real impact of this incident was just beginning. Outside the police station, General Wilson blinked in the glare of unexpected camera lights. Somehow, word had gotten out. 3 news vans were parked across the street, reporters already setting up equipment. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered as well, some filming with their phones. "This way, sir," Agent Chen guided him toward a black SUV rather than his own car. "Your vehicle will be delivered to your home. We thought you might prefer to avoid the press for now." Wilson nodded, grateful for the consideration. As they walked toward the SUV, he spotted Officer Clark speaking with another agent, gesturing expressively as if explaining something important. The young officer caught Wilson's eye and gave a small nod that seemed part apology, part respect. Inside the SUV's quiet interior, Wilson finally allowed himself a deep breath. His wrists still bore faint red marks from the handcuffs, a reminder of how quickly dignity could be stripped away, regardless of rank or service. "The secretary will speak with you shortly," Agent Chen said, handing him a secure phone. "In the meantime, I've been asked to brief you on developments." Those developments, it turned out, were substantial. In the hour since his arrest, the machinery of government had moved with surprising speed. The Chief of Staff of the Army had personally called the state governor. The Pentagon's legal office had already requested all body camera footage and station surveillance. Most significantly, Officer Reynolds had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. "There's also this," Chen added, showing Wilson her tablet. On the screen was a social media video already gathering thousands of shares. A neighbor had filmed his arrest from across the street. The caption read, "This man told police he was a general and they laughed at him. Then the Pentagon showed up." Wilson shook his head slightly. "Not how I planned to make the news." "Sir," The Pentagon press office is preparing a statement. They'd like your input. Before Wilson could respond, the secure phone rang. The voice that came through was instantly recognizable. The Secretary of Defense himself, calling from Washington. General Wilson, the Secretary began, I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced tonight. It's completely unacceptable. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The President has been briefed, the Secretary continued. He's concerned and wants updates. This incident, well, it highlights problems we've been discussing at the cabinet level for months now. Wilson understood the subtext. His wrongful arrest was becoming more than a personal indignity, it was transforming into a powerful example of the very issues many Americans face daily. How would you like to proceed, General? The Secretary asked. Whatever resources you need are at your disposal. Wilson thought carefully before answering. He could demand the officer's firing. He could file charges of his own. He could use his position to make an example of this small police department. But none of those options addressed the larger problem. I'd like to take a different approach, Mr. Secretary, Wilson replied. With your permission, I'd like to use this incident constructively. By the time the SUV pulled into his driveway, Wilson had outlined a plan that the Secretary enthusiastically endorsed. Rather than simply punishing those involved, Wilson proposed something more meaningful, a comprehensive program where military leadership would work with police departments on training and community relations. His wife was waiting at the door, worry etched on her face despite the calls he'd made to reassure her. As they embraced, a second SUV pulled up, carrying a Pentagon press liaison who would help manage the growing media interest. I saw it on the news, his wife said quietly. Are you okay? I'm fine, Wilson assured her, but this isn't over. Inside, they'd found their daughter had arrived early from college, drawn home by the breaking news stories about her father. Her eyes were red from crying, but her expression showed relief and pride as she hugged him tightly. Dad, everyone at school is sharing the videos, she told him. My friends are all texting me. People are calling you a hero for how you handled it. Wilson shook his head. I'm no hero. I just want something good to come from this. As his family gathered in the living room, Wilson's phone buzzed with texts and calls from fellow officers, officials, and even a few celebrities who had seen the viral videos. But among the many messages, one stood out. A text from an unknown number that simply read, "Thank you for not forgetting. Anthony from the cell." The events of the night had set something important in motion, something that would extend far beyond one wrongful arrest. Tomorrow would bring press conferences and official statements, but tonight was for family. The real work would begin in the morning. 3 weeks after the arrest, General Wilson stood at a podium in the Riverside Police Department's community room. The place was packed with reporters, city officials, police officers, and community members. Camera flashes lit up the room as Wilson, dressed in his full military uniform with all his medals and ribbons, prepared to speak. What happened to me that night could have ended very differently, Wilson began, his voice steady and clear. I was fortunate to have resources many others don't have. A phone call that changed everything. But true justice shouldn't depend on who you know or what position you hold. In the front row sat Officer Clark, now promoted to community liaison. Beside him was Anthony, the young man from the holding cell, wearing a new suit and a nervous smile. Wilson had kept his promise, he hadn't forgotten. After learning that Anthony had been arrested for a minor offense while walking home from his late-night job, Wilson had arranged for legal help that resulted in all charges being dropped. Behind them sat Wilson's wife and daughter, watching with proud expressions as he outlined the new training program that would begin next month. A collaboration between military leadership experts and police departments across the state. This program isn't about pointing fingers, Wilson explained. It's about building understanding. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their appearance, is treated with basic dignity and respect. The police chief, who had personally apologized to Wilson the morning after the arrest, nodded in agreement from his seat on the stage. The department had faced harsh criticism after body camera footage was released showing Officer Reynolds dismissing Wilson's military ID and making several concerning comments during the arrest. That footage had gone viral, viewed over 20 million times across social media platforms. What could have been just another story of injustice had instead become a catalyst for real change, largely due to Wilson's measured response and unwillingness to simply walk away once his own situation was resolved. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the Pentagon has established a new civil rights response unit, Wilson continued. This team will provide resources and support to service members who face discrimination, while also working with civilian agencies to improve community relations. The crowd applauded as Wilson revealed that Anthony had been hired as one of the unit's first civilian coordinators, helping to bridge the gap between military resources and community needs. Officer Reynolds was not present at the ceremony. The Internal Affairs investigation had uncovered a troubling history of similar incidents in his record. He had been dismissed from the force 2 weeks earlier, with the police union choosing not to contest the decision after reviewing the evidence. Real change happens when we turn difficult moments into opportunities to do better, Wilson said as he neared the end of his speech. My 32 years of military service taught me that leadership isn't about avoiding problems, it's about how we respond to them. As Wilson stepped away from the podium, the crowd rose in a standing ovation. Community leaders who had initially been skeptical of any meaningful outcome now approached to shake his hand. Local children who had been brought by their parents asked for autographs, looking at his medals with wide eyes. Later that evening, Wilson sat on his back porch with his wife, watching the sunset. His phone buzzed with yet another interview request. His story had resonated far beyond what he'd expected. "Did you ever imagine that getting pulled over would lead to all this?" his wife asked, taking his hand. Wilson shook his head. "Never, but sometimes the worst moments lead to the best opportunities." Inside, they could hear their daughter on a video call with her college friends, excitedly explaining her father's new program and how it would be implemented in police academies across the country. She had decided to change her major to public policy, inspired by how her father had transformed a personal injustice into meaningful action. 6 months later, Wilson stood in the White House Rose Garden as the president signed an executive order implementing nationwide training standards based on the program Wilson had developed. Anthony stood nearby, now working full-time with the Civil Rights Response Unit and taking night classes to finish his degree. What had begun as one officer's prejudice had become the catalyst for Wilson's most important mission yet, not on a foreign battlefield, but right here at home, fighting for the dignity and respect that everyone deserves, regardless of rank or status or the color of their skin. Sometimes, the most important victories come from the most unexpected battles.